So if we could start perhaps by you saying who you are, and then I think you've got a statement that you're going to be making.
I've got stuff to go through, yes.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Exactly. And
so your stuff,
yes,
we would welcome hearing.
Yes, okay.
All right, so if we start, and if you could
can just stop me. Shall I just go and you can just stop me when you want?
Yes, just before we do that, can I ask you, are you being sponsored by anybody? I presume that, no. So you're an independent journalist,
yes,
who actually, when you do work and it gets on the television or whatever, you then get paid for the work you've done.
So I get paid a salary, and whatever work I do throughout the year doesn't affect my salary. So
yes, and that's from Sky News,
yes,
or something. Yes. All right. Thanks very much.
Yes.
Just to make that clear.
Okay.
All right.
So I am Jason Farrell. I am a correspondent for Sky News. I'm currently home editor, but I've also been a political editor. At the time I started looking at Primodos, I was actually an investigations editor or correspondent, looking into a number of different issues around whatever really we chose to look at. And I was contacted by in 2011, who is an alleged Primodos sufferer, who said he had lots of documents in his loft that he'd discovered from his mother that he wanted me to look at. And that is where I would really like to start with my submissions, because that's where it started for me, going to meet this man who had all these documents that interested me almost immediately in what they said. I won't reference every single thing because I'm sure you know a lot about a lot of them. So obviously I saw the study from Isabel Gao and the concerns that she raised in 1967. I saw the report by Dennis Cook, the statistician, who also raised concerns about the correlation between the use of Primodos and the number of abnormalities across the UK. And I saw references to the report by Norman Dean from the Royal College of GPs. All these things sort of spiked my interest. The various correspondence that he had between the drugs company representatives in the UK and Berlin expressing concern. And I really wanted to start by talking about that because, I'm not a medical expert. I am, as you say, just a journalist who looks into documents and sees what he sees and tries to extrapolate information from those documents. So whilst I don't think that I'll ever be able to sit here and prove a causal association between Primodos and birth defects, I think what I can prove, and I think what is evidenced in this, is that there was enough alarm, enough concern that it was raised with the regulators and the manufacturer that they should have done something. And I feel that the main question of the day is whether these victims were let down by the lack of action based on the knowledge they had and based on the necessity of the drug. And whilst I've also looked at sodium valproate and I understand that there was a different level of need in that drug, I think this is a big question on Primodos, and it's a slightly different question. I also think that, I will refer to this in a bit, but the review team that set out to make their review, the expert working group, which was published in 2017, stated very clearly that they wanted to look to the future. I think that was a mistake. I think if you're going to look at this, you want to look what went wrong in the past. I'd make the comparisons to Hillsborough. If you were to say, let's look at Hillsborough and see how we can improve stadiums, it would be pointless, because we've already done it. But if you say, let's look at Hillsborough and see who made the mistakes, that's the right way to look at it. And I hope that that's what this inquiry will do. I want to start by talking about the letter that Dr. Pitchford wrote in 1968. Alan Pitchford and Patrick I, medical directors of Shearing in the UK, wrote to Dr. Friebel in Berlin. And they had seen the statistician's report from Dennis Cook, which I've got here. I'm sure you've got all of this, but if you haven't got any of it, he talked about the strong correlation between the Primodos usage and malformations in general society, off the back of what we'd already seen from Isabel Gao. And he wrote to them, he said, "We must reach a decision regarding our own product, Primodos, and its possible relationship to fetal abnormalities. As manufacturers, it's our moral duty to do all possible to ensure the safety of the preparations which we market. Where suspicion of this kind has been aroused by an investigator whose integrity and ability cannot likely be challenged, the onus of proof must lie with us. It is for us to establish that the drug is safe to use. I think that's probably the most sensible thing that's ever been said about this. And the response that he got from Freeball was that they had done he said that they were doing their own research they'd done their own research in Berlin that actually contradicted what Dennis Cook had said about the number of abnormalities related to the German figures suggested that actually there was no correlation. But the figures that he was referring to only recorded deaths from abnormalities. And as we know that with Primodos, quite a lot of abnormalities don't actually necessarily lead to that. So already I feel that Freeball in Germany was being dishonest to Pitchford in the UK. His second line of defence was that studies were in progress with rats and mice. Now, I haven't seen that, but I've seen that recorded in the Sunday Times. But it was also, they also say that this was untrue, and the UK would later discover that what was being tested was contraceptive pills, Anavar and Gynavar. Pitchford then turned to the regulator, the Committee on Safety of Medicines, who again proved a kind of poor ally by saying that they were unhappy about the use of pregnancy tests, but insufficient information for any definite action. There was insufficient information for any definite action to be taken. Now that was Dr. Inman who wrote that, and obviously I think that becomes more relevant down the line, that it was Dr. Inman who decided not to take action from the UK authorities that could have helped support Pitchford's case to get Primodos removed from the market. Then obviously in January 1969 the Royal College of GPs privately circulated their survey amongst the drug companies, and we know that Norman Dean called for the drug to be removed. Although the president of the college, Dr. Kunzberg, wrote to the drugs companies saying that he hoped that they would not be worried by Dr. Dean's personal opinion, and it seems that they were not. As far as I know, that study remains unpublished. And we talked about that in my evidence. I know you wrote back to me about it. But what I do have is, I think you probably have, which is this letter that he wrote to Pitchford. The Dean wrote to Pitchford saying, it gives an overview of the figures and saying these figures are not conclusive of themselves, but if these data are independent of Dr. Gall's, it is alarming that they show trends in the same direction. And in this letter he calls for the drug to be removed. Yes, in the view of these findings, tentative though they are, it would be my own view that since there is, in any event, no real sound medical reason, in my opinion, for the use of such hormone preparations, Primodos should be withdrawn from use, Dr. Dean. So, just in case you didn't have them, I've got that. And I've also got the Sunday Times article which illustrates some of these points that I'm making about the letters that have been written. So Dr. Inman wrote back again about this data from Norman Dean, that the data you have so far is quite unhelpful in coming to a decision. The Sunday Times journalist who wrote this article in '78, I think sums it up quite well. He says the ineffectiveness of the committee had a simple cause. Before it was willing to pass judgment on a drug, it demanded the highest standards of scientific proof, which was credible, but ignored the common sense approach that the possible risks of a drug have to be balanced against its value. And the fact was that since the early 1960s, hormone tests had been unnecessary because the simpler urine tests were available. Shearing knew this, and Dr. Pitchford wrote to Freeball again in 1969, "There is very little justification for the use of Primodos when more rapid diagnosis can be made by means of the slide tube test. It is extremely disturbing that the results of statistics, human studies and animal studies all point clearly to the possibility that Primodos may interfere with pregnancy." According to the Sunday Times, in this article, Shearing issued a booklet in 1969 to doctors saying an existing pregnancy is unaffected by Primodos. So it's not just that they sort of tried to sort of see what would happen next. They were trying to reassure doctors that this was okay. The same year, Roussel dropped its indication for premature pregnancy. Pitchford wrote a letter in August 1969. A long-term study, he said, in humans is nearing completion. The computer analysis should be available shortly. An interim analysis revealed statistically significant abnormalities in patients receiving hormone pregnancy tests. By this time, the Swedes banned it in 1970, the Finns in 71. In UK, sales continued to rise until 1972, and of course Primodos was the marking leader. And they knew from their own research that they'd done in 1968 that 3/4 of the use of Primodos was for early diagnosis of pregnancy. Now, I'll come to it later about the labelling and the indication change in 1970, but there was clearly no attempt to warn doctors and no requirement to do so by the regulators. And even in 1974, subsidiaries were instructed to tell doctors. Shearing expert panel was of the opinion that despite the exceptionally widespread use of this prescription, there have been specifically no adverse effects occurring until now upon the embryo in the fetus or an existing pregnancy. That ignores the scientific evidence. Compare it to the FDA, who summarised in January 1975, sex hormones should not be used in pregnancy for any purpose. Such use of hormones may seriously damage the fetus, including heart, limb reduction defects. So it wasn't until, I think even in April, when they had their prelim findings from Greenberg and Inman, it wasn't until after the Sunday Times actually highlighted the consequences in May and the inconsistencies that the committee actually released the warning to doctors, which was clearly inadequate because it was continued to be used until 1977 when they had to release the warning again. Again, if you haven't got those warnings, I have them, I'm sure you have them, but it's quite unequivocal in 1977 that they say that the association has been confirmed. I just wanted to run through all of that to remind ourselves how much panic there was in the UK about this particular drug. And I know that we've submitted an interview that we're probably going to broadcast this week of an employee who was actually told by scientists, she says, and again, this is a woman who has no axe to bear with the company. She's worked there and had a good career, she said. You know, she really liked working for the company, but she says she was told by the scientists not to use the drug. The receptionist in the company itself, because it might lead to deformity of her baby. Why were they telling that to one of their own employees and not saying it to the public? I think that's pretty damning. With regards to Norman Dean's study, I also want to submit to you the Royal College of GPs advice that they were taking around the trial, compared to because it strikes me that they decided not to release Norman Dean's study ahead of the trial in 1982, and they say it was of opinion that it would be unwise for the Royal College to appear to be taking sides in litigation of this nature, and if they were to hand over all their information to the plaintiffs merely on the basis of one short letter, they might appear to be doing just this. It would be advisable for them to wait until there was a court order compelling them to disclose the information. So they clearly had the information, and they chose not to release Norman Dean's report. We actually have a private letter from Norman Dean that he wrote in 1973, where he says he had a bad conscience, although really not on my own behalf, about this whole business, which I can, again, give you that. I just want to go on about what they say in the Royal College of GPs about Dean's report, because it's someone else who has assessed it. And this person says, sorry, I'll get their name in a minute because it comes up in the writing. They did say the conclusion that Primodos definitely does not cause malformations is a slightly different matter, and he would not be prepared to say that. The true position appears to be that the question is one of the greatest possible controversy and uncertainty, and the medical world cannot really give a definitive answer either way, although it indicates towards a view that malformations are not caused by taking the drug. He went on to say that his own personal evaluation, he thought there was a distinct possibility that the use of hormone pregnancy tests might cause abortion, but this was a more controversial matter than the question of malformations, and when he had written the short paper suggesting this. It's possible that he will be asked searching general questions about the coincidence of hormonal pregnancy tests and the damaging natures of the fetus, and he would therefore be forced into mentioning that it's possible connection between these drugs and abortion. Why is the Royal College of GPs worried about doing that? Some of the cases, they say on their records, would probably provide better evidence for the plaintiffs in the main action than they already have. Why are they worried about releasing that? They've given it to the drugs company. They're already taking sides. They didn't just give it to the government, they're paid to provide it to the drugs company. This letter here, that decision was influenced by the previous receipt of money from sharing from information supplied to them about HPT. I don't need to read the whole letter because I don't want to take that out of context. But it's clear from this that they were paid to provide that information. And yet they weren't prepared to provide it for plaintiffs. This is the Royal College of GPs.
Sorry, they were paid?
They were paid to do the report.
Yes, by sharing.
By sharing, according to this. Okay. Yes. So I've got that. Okay. So the letters I referred to and stuff from the Sunday Times, much of it's in here if you need it, the letters to Freebull. If you decide to make any use of that. You've obviously already seen the stuff from Berlin, but I think this is really the most shocking thing. And I know we're not sure now what this 5-to-1. There's a question now. This 5-to-1 risk.
You mean absolute as opposed to relative risk?
So yeah, my understanding on the 5-to-1 risk is that it's a 5-to-1 risk.
Yes.
The relative refers to, well, it's almost a 5-to-1 risk. That's what I was told when you asked me. I checked out.
I see.
I spoke to Tobias, since unfortunately he's not here today. But that was his interpretation. That was his interpretation of it. We always referred to 5-to-1. Actually, we never said 20% in the piece.
Yes.
So if the risk is 2% and it's a 5-to-1 increase, then obviously the risk is only 10%. So my understanding of that is not 100% clear, but we've always interpreted it as a 5-to-1 risk means you've got a 5-to-1 risk. And I'll make reference to another document that seems to make the same assumption in a minute. But the fact that over 5 years, he says, he's been monitoring pregnant women and showed that those who underwent hormone tests had a risk, or relative risk, of 5-to-1 giving birth with child malformations. And he wrote this in January 1975. So as we've said, months before they decided to do anything about it. And then he says the research is not completely finalised, but one might expect publication of these findings within the next 6 months. And in order to avoid any unnecessary tension, one decided to go the unofficial route and pass the findings to the manufacturer at this stage so that they can take measures to avoid medical legal problems. I mean, that is just not the way that a regulator should be behaving. And if you add it to what we've seen in the way that the regulator didn't respond in 1969, one can perhaps see the motivation behind the way in which Inman acts. It's not necessarily just thinking of the company. I think he may well be motivated by his own mistakes. And my worry about that is that this is the guy who actually his name is on the report that ultimately led to the stuff being taken off the market. And if he's motivated to warn the company, to warn them about medical legal challenges, and as we learn later, to actually destroy the documents, has he given us the full picture of just how bad things were? It is significant, Dr. Dieterling writes in 1978, that he destroyed or obscured all materials in which investigations have been based, which will make it impossible to trace the individual cases which form the basis of the investigation. I understand that Dr. Inman is saying that he'd done that to prevent individual claims being based on his materials. What right did he have to do that? I don't think he had any right to do that. In 1975, Pitchford's still bashing away at the sales department. As far as he's concerned, they should immediately change the text on the data card for Primodos to include pregnancy as a contraindication, to send this amended data card ASAP to GPs and gynaecologists and obstetricians. This would be sufficient from a medical legal point of view, but he was of the opinion that things should not be left at that. Even if we do not yet have the committee's findings, there is mounting suspicion against hormonal pregnancy tests. So we should seriously be withdrawing the product. The matter is urgent. He writes a letter in March 75 to Dr. Ish, because the sales department has made a decision not to do this. He says he's still of the same opinion expressed in 1969. when he wrote to Dr. Freeball regarding Primodos oral, and he attached a copy of that letter. So he says he's the one who's responsible for the safety of the products before the UK authorities, and he must say for the record that he's not at all in agreement with the sales department's decision. The sales department, by the way, have said that listing pregnancy as a contraindication in the UK would be tantamount to a concession which might be construed as a precedence by authorities in other countries. And they decide that they're not going to change the indication until they're forced to. So they clearly aren't that interested in this new information.
Jason, what date was that?
Yeah. 3rd of the 3rd, 1975. March. And it's in the Berlin archives in file 13198. This is all kind of compilation of events put together by Dietrich. I bring you on to points that were later made to the manufacturer by their lawyer. Again, I know I've raised these, but I just thought may as well put some of them on the record here. Because it's not just their own scientists in the UK and various experts warning them this, but their lawyers do point out that they've made mistakes. Mr. Clothier pointed out that after thalidomide there was a duty for the manufacturers in the pharmaceutical field to retest their products in order to determine beyond doubt that they were harmless. He went on to talk about the letter that Pitchford wrote to Dr. By, requesting that.
Sorry, Mr. Clothier is our
he is
the
the
QC
QC.
here.
Yeah.
Jeffrey Clothier.
So this is Pharmaceutical Division notes on a meeting held on the 21st of December 1977 at Temple in London with Mr. Clothier and various representatives from Shearing.
Right.
He requests. Mr. Clothier went on to talk about the letter that Pitchford had sent to By and suggested that this would be dynamite in the hands of the claimants. Another memo from Dr. Pitchford to Freeball in '69 was raised by Mr. Clothier. This memo was a summary of events that stated that Shearing should abandon the product for use in pregnancy testing. Mr. Clothier wished to know what had been done in response to this. There's a question about whether they should have undergone a study at the cost of £9,000, which would have been fully justified now, he says. He said, and I think this is important, I keep coming back to this idea that they changed the instructions in 1970. He said, changing the wording of the instructions in March 1970, this wording was not explicit enough and should have shown a contraindication. And this point is, of course, vitally important in the Williams case, which is obviously the case that was being put forward in 1982. Dr. Dietering agreed with Mr. Clothier on this. The wording did not inhibit doctors from using Primodos in pregnant women. So they agreed on it. All the instructions state that there would not be a result. All the instructions state is that there would not be a result on someone who is pregnant. The wording would not have implied to the Williams doctors that Primodos drug was dangerous in pregnant women. So I don't know what they changed. I don't know exactly how they... Because it's clearly stated that they did change it in the report that came out last year. Mr. Clothier summarised at this juncture the benefits-risk ratio had changed very significantly, and that there really should have been something done at that time to indicate some degree of concern. He went on to state that continued studies would have been useful to Shearing, a study which shows that the drug could not have caused the malformations.
So what date is this?
This is the same, I'm referring to the same thing, so it's 1977, 21st of December.
Thank you.
Mr. Clothier raised the fact that he had nothing on file for the years 1970 to in 1973. Crucial years when they were told that they were looking into all of this. They've got nothing on file. Mr. Clothier felt the case, if this case was tried to the end by a judge, the chances are the company would be found in neglect of its duty. Mr. Clothier stated it would seem to be, this is where I come on to the 5-to-1. So he says, this is kind of weird, but Mr. Clothier stated that there would seem to be a 5-to-1 chance that if there is a malformation in the child the mother took Primodos while pregnant, it is the fault of the drug. It's a slightly weirdly presented sentence, but I interpret it as he's saying if there is a 5-to-1 chance that the mother who took Primodos has a deformed child, then it must be the drug's fault. And then the drug must be at fault. But you can read that and interpret it how you like. But it's interesting to me that he says 5-to-1 chance rather than 5-to-1 relative risk. But then he is a lawyer, and he may have just pronounced it wrong. But what really interests me about this is that this is 1977. And the public haven't been told about a 5-to-1 chance or a 5-to-1 relative risk. Never.
Yes, they had in Isabel Gall's 67 paper. The relative risk was 5-to-1.
She said that.
She didn't pronounce it as such, but if
you look at the figures,
statistics in her figures, it's around.
So actually, that matches. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
So the Gall figures would potentially match the Inman figures.
Potentially, yes.
If it was a relative risk of 5-to-1.
I think I would need to go back over the Gall paper.
Yeah.
But my reading of that originally is yes.
Right. Okay. I don't think that was. If that's the case, then you could say that the public were aware of the Gall paper from 1967. But I don't think that this has been explicitly made clear to the public that there was a 5-to-1 risk. Or if it has, obviously we know that over the course of those 7 or 8 years.
I'm sorry. Saying the public were aware is not. It's saying it was in the public domain.
Yeah.
Not all the public were aware.
Yes.
Yes.
We need to be clear about that. Is that right?
Whether what was in the public domain.
The
Gall's report was
risk.
definitely. If he's referring to Gall's report, I don't know if he is. I don't think he's necessarily collated the Gall
Can I just
report.
for a moment assume
Yeah.
that what we're talking about here is a relative risk as opposed to an
Okay,
absolute
let's
risk
assume that, yeah.
of 5-to-1,
Yeah.
and that was in the public domain in 1967.
Yeah.
Now, that's not the same as saying the public were aware,
Yes.
because
obviously, if they were aware, they wouldn't have been taking the
The
drug in
public aren't necessarily
1967.
aware of what's in the public domain.
No.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, the most important thing, isn't it, is where doctors were aware.
Yeah. Thank you.
And people subscribing it, because they're the only people who can really advise the public. Anyway, Clothier says they need an epidemiologist on their side. They need to get this looked into. I'm not going to go through the whole of this stuff, but again, all of this
Sorry,
is here.
Jason, can I just ask then, following on from what Cyril was asking, were the doctors aware? We
No.
say it's in the public domain.
No, they were aware
The
in
public don't
1975 that
necessarily know, but the doctors were aware.
the doctors, as far as I can tell, there's no evidence that the doctors were aware until
Right.
1975,
Right.
and when the letter went out. And you have to. I don't know if you've seen it. I'd be very interested to know if you've seen anything contrary to that. But the first thing I can see from the UK authorities is the letter that I just waved at you a while back, sent in 1975, warning them.
But in 1970, when the indication was removed, doctors were notified via IMMDS.
They were notified.
Yes.
Okay. Well, what I don't get.
I mean, it wasn't drawn to their attention, but the prop list was sent to all prescribers in GPs and hospitals, and that showed that the only indications on these that were left were for the treatment of secondary amenorrhea. The indication for pregnancy testing was removed.
So why then in 1974, and I'm just curious, did Shearing write?
I can't answer that, is the answer. I don't know. It is odd. Because they did.
Yeah, so you've seen this letter that they wrote saying we need to change the indication.
Yeah. But the indication was changed in 1970 by the McGregor Committee. And that's what I'm...
So what had they? So yeah, I don't understand why they would have done that, because that's what I was coming to. I don't understand this. But it makes sense. It makes sense on one level. If they really had stopped the indication, and the doctors knew about it, why did the sales go up from 183,000 to 223,000 in 1970, and in 1971 go up to 233,000? You know, if they'd made it all clear to the doctors that this is not. I mean,
I think
this says to me that they didn't change it. But if they did and they sent out a message, then I hadn't been aware of that.
I think there's a difference between changing the indication and certainly sending like a Dear Doctor letter that's very much evident.
Yes.
Whereas in the prop list and IMMD, you had to look for the information. It wasn't overtly presented.
Yes.
So that may explain the difference in the numbers.
Yes. Well, you guys have to decide whether you think that's good enough.
Thanks.
But I don't think it is. And I actually think it makes it all the more horrifying, actually, that they quietly did it. Because then that just goes to show, doesn't it, that they knew, and as I said to you, they also knew that the majority of the use of their drug was used by pregnant women. Either a horrific lack of communication, for which the users of Primodos can bear no responsibility, and the drug company and the regulators can, or it was deliberately surreptitious. And I can't possibly answer that. But what I can say.
Jason, can I just ask, have you come across any other example by Bayer Shearing where an indication has been removed and they followed it through with very clear publicity?
No.
Anything else? So we haven't got any comparables.
Oh, I see it. Yeah, no. I mean, I'm not here to.
No.
I'm not here to talk about any other drugs, but
no.
I did do a report on valproate sodium.
It was just that comparable, whether they had behaved similarly.
Where they'd seen the science and they decided that patients shouldn't know. I'm sure you've seen that. And if you look at the names on the list, you'll see Dr. Inman on there. I think this is sort of, I don't know, this is a sort of we know better approach. I don't know. I find the valproate thing a very interesting and quite complicated dilemma that they had. They were worried that people were going to die if they stopped taking the drug. It's not the case here. And, they didn't have that moral dilemma. The moral dilemma that they had, the decision they chose has left us where we are, with mothers with epilepsy having to deal with children with terrible disabilities. That's the decision they made. Maybe they can justify it. Can't justify this. And whether they quietly changed some aspects of the way in which the drug was, I just don't see how they can say that they weren't promoting it as a pregnancy test, or that they had properly followed all the procedures to allow this drug, and for doctors to know and for patients to know that it shouldn't be used. And I also feel that, whilst this drug was on the market and being used in that way, they should have been looking at doing the proper tests, which it's clear that they didn't do. And it feels to me like, well, it's all very well for Dr. Inman to be doing a quiet study on humans for 5 years to see whether this drug actually did cause the malformations, and after 5 years deciding that it did. Well, humans aren't guinea pigs. They're not lab rats. The fact that he did this study for 5 years is in itself damning enough. That he just decided, okay, well, we'll just go off and quietly do this. And 5 years down the line, we're going to say, actually, do you know what, there is a problem. And that's what Tuchman de Pless tells the company in February 1978. They ask him, did we as a company carry out all the studies that we were supposed to? In Professor Tuchman's opinion, we should have done much more. He expressed the view that after discovering that certain dose was embryo lethal in rabbits and rats, we should have certainly carried out teratological studies in primates in 1968. He stated that the state of the art at the time was such that any ethical company using a drug with pregnancy as one indication should have known that primate studies should have been carried out. He declared that the lack of primate studies was, in his opinion, a very important and fragile point for shearing. He stated in overall terms his general impression of the situation was quite pessimistic. 4 quotations will suffice to express his opinion. This is in a letter from Dr. Wiseman in 1978 on the 17th of February this is from Dr. Dietering to Dr. Wiseman. The 4 quotations are, the only point where you can argue is over the question of causality. If you can throw down causality, perhaps your culpability will be decreased. There's no doubt you will be considered guilty because you haven't done enough. You must face reality. The eventual outcome will only be a gentleman's agreement. It's a leading expert at the time that they've called in to assess what they're doing. I've already submitted some evidence about the fact that they were aware that this was being used by some women for abortions. I mean, I'm not going to go into that because you've already seen the submissions, but that also to me suggests, even if there's a chance that this pregnancy test can cause someone to have an abortion that they don't want, feels to me like they should have taken it off the market. I feel that the regulator's response was summed up in this letter that Dr. Inman wrote about Dr. Gao, which I think maybe you've heard mentioned before, where he says that Dr. Gao fears that by not drawing attention to the hazard, that a large number of abnormal babies may have been born during the 8 years that have elapsed since she raised the issue. And he says we're defenceless in the matter of the 8-year delay. I think he knows they've made a mistake. I mean, he says it here. The regulator knows he's made a mistake. Shouldn't have waited 8 years to take it off the market. What I don't understand really is why they didn't. And I think a lot of us struggle with this because I don't think that people who develop drugs are sinister monsters, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. So the first point I was going to make about this, I've already made, about it being forward-looking. I think they got that wrong. I'm very confused about what happened with which they talk about the way in which it was, the labelling was changed. There's always a confusion about why it was withdrawn from the market. Did they withdraw it? Were they told to withdraw it out, or did they withdraw it for commercial reasons? Their lawyer advised them to suggest that we say something along the lines that sales in the UK do not justify selling the product, i.e. it's not commercially viable. So they weren't actually willing to ever say. He says the decision still to be made on the wording used for the discontinuance of Primonos, but he felt a low profile was necessary. Wallace believed that if the company stated the product was being withdrawn because of the fall in turnover figures, it would be said that we had other products that experienced a greater fall in turnover. Why did we not discontinue? So they had a big discussion about what excuse they were going to give to withdraw it. I've already given you a very kind of full attack document on this. I think I've kind of made my feelings quite clear about it. I just reiterate a couple of points. I don't understand why they came to the conclusions they did on the animal studies when they've got lines in there about studies talking about the increase of malformations in the studies should be considered drug related. If that's the case, then it's drug related, but apparently it's not. It's a shame that you haven't got Tobias here because he's done a full assessment of the animal studies. I don't think I should try and replicate or even do a poor example of that. On the epidemiological stuff, again, I just looked through it and thought it doesn't make sense. The conclusion doesn't make sense. They have this line in here, for example, the study to be considered the most robust, Heinen in 1977, showed a statistically significant twofold increase of cardiovascular anomalies. But then it kind of knocks it down, saying that the exposure was questioned by other publications, Wilson and Wiseman in 1984. Well, Wiseman worked for Shearing, and Wiseman's study was knocked down by Hook. I haven't got the date for his study, and I actually pulled it out, but it got rained on. But I've got another, it's online, the Hook study's online, you've seen it. So you know that he essentially says the relative risk actually rose if you apply the way in which Wiseman did this study unbiasedly. And that this would result in increased measure of the effect. And as you know, we've argued that to say that the studies have flaws, and therefore the rest might have been lower, equally those flawed studies might not have calculated the true extent of the risk. And I don't think that that's really been assessed by this group. It just doesn't feel to me like it's been assessed properly. And the other thing that concerned me is, again, they make this reference in the Greenberg one, which again observed a statistically significant risk and is considered to be amongst the better quality studies of the time. But then they say that the comparator group were not women who also sought the pregnancy test. So what? I did ask them, why does that matter in the press conference? And they didn't seem to be able to give me an explanation. Although it was mentioned several times in this report that women who didn't seek a pregnancy test might not be a reasonable comparator group. I'm sure when you hear from Jesse this afternoon, I believe he's giving evidence, there's no reason for making that assumption. And unless there's a scientific reason, which they haven't given in this report, for making that assumption, I don't see why they do. I don't see why the report they produced in October had this forest graph in it, but it wasn't in the eventual report. And this forest graph, which plots the assessment of the epidemiological studies for all congenital abnormalities, shows that 8 of them showed a veered towards an association, and only 2 veered against. And quite frankly, if we look at the ones they did include, if you look at the ones that they included, they all seem to show an association. And on Friday, I interviewed Carl Hedigan. I don't know if he's going to give evidence to you guys. He is. Well, he said to me that it looks like they did do the pooled data, metadata analysis, but they didn't include it. He's done the metadata analysis, he's pooled it, and he's found that there is an association. So he's looked at the same stuff, and he's a pretty reputable guy with no axe to grind, totally independently, looked at this and said it's wrong. It's wrong, they've done it wrong. And I challenge them to look at his stuff and see if he's got it wrong, because I don't think he has. And he said to me, you start by just doing a visual check and looking down the line and seeing if you can just make a general assessment of how it looks, which is what we did, very unscientifically. But he has very scientifically shown that Vactorol and limb reductions, and I think particularly heart problems, there is an association, which is the opposite of this conclusion. And I worry that when Alison Gebby was giving evidence to MPs about why they'd changed the document, and as we found out, they took out the line saying that it was not possible to reach a definitive conclusion, I worry that she said that they were told to strengthen it up. And who told them to do that? And I really worry about that because of all the rest of it that's gone before it. You know, that's the last thing you want to do when you've got so much doubt from history, is to just create more doubt. And I just don't think that it's acceptable anymore for the victims to be the ones left having to prove anything. I don't think they deserve that. I don't think they have to prove anything. I think if the drugs company wants to come here and say, here's the test that showed why we kept it on the market, then fine. But they've never done that. And I therefore think that this, along with what we're now seeing from Carl and what we've seen from Neil shows there's more than prima facie evidence that there's a problem. But the real evidence that we've got in hard writing here from those letters from Dr. Pitchford, from what we've seen from the stuff in Berlin, the real evidence is that they didn't act on the warnings that they know they had. I will also give you, if you haven't got it, the World Health Organization document that's produced in 77, sorry, which I've just highlighted all the different reports around the world that were making the same conclusions. I don't know if you've seen the reports from India that were done in the 80s into the same conclusions. It's all there. It's all just, there's nothing, there's not that, definitive piece of evidence. But when you put together, as Pitchford said, the statistics, the animal studies, the human studies, you put it all together, I don't know how you can come to any other conclusion. And then I think the other thing which I just wanted to say that obviously we will give to you is the thing that we raised in our documentary about the relationship between Primados and Gestest. And you've seen the court case that happened in America, and that there was a payout. And obviously you've seen the interview that we have done with the mother in Florida, who talks about how that came about. And the last thing that I found as I was going through my notes was something that Isabel Gall put together for Jack Ashley. Actually, it was a report where she, I don't think I'll even go through and repeat all the things that she said. I've just highlighted in here what I think as the points that I'm trying to make, which she says that basically the regulators failed to act for 8 years. And she sets out the various reports that they were aware of, and quite compelling arguments as to, the points in which I thought it was interesting that she said, right back at the start when she produced her report in 1967, that it had produced prima facie evidence that abnormalities may be drug induced. And they told her that in 1967, on June 22nd. And I just don't understand why, if she'd already done that and she'd proved that prima facie evidence, why they didn't act more rapidly. So I just think perhaps she should have the last word on all of that, seeing as she started it. And that's really, along with all the things I've already submitted, what I have to say.
Yes. Jason, thank you so much. I must say that is hugely impressive. Some of us have had views about journalism. I used to be on the press council. But that, I must say, is just formidable. Thank you very much. Simon Whale would just like to ask a question.
I'm just conscious of time, Jason, but that just endorse what Baroness Cumberland just said. That's been very, very helpful and impressive. One thing I wasn't sure about was whether there's anything you wanted to say about the collapse of the litigation here in the UK in 1983 and the circumstances surrounding that. I'm not sure how closely you've looked at that, or whether you've got anything you want to share with us about that.
Well, I've done interviews with people who were involved in that, and obviously there was suspicion around the way in which certain people who were deemed to be experts, who were going to stand and represent the plaintiffs, then kind of fell away. They clearly felt that they had a strong case, and they were discouraged eventually by their lawyer from going further, because the experts that that Shearing put up against them were deemed to be too heavy in number and expertise for them to take on. Look, the thing, you know, I don't have any firm evidence around how that happened, or whether people were, you know, offered various things to not give evidence. I would say that one of the key expert witnesses for Bayer was Briggs, who I referred to there. And if you want to understand more about Briggs, it might be worth you talking to Brian Deere, journalist Brian Deere, who, or I've got an interview with him that I can submit to you, which we didn't run in the piece. Basically, he ran an article which showed that Briggs had made up medical evidence, and he wasn't as reliable as perhaps people thought he was in 1982. And it's not my journalism, so I'm not going to talk about it really, but I have got an interview with Brian Deere, or Brian Deere is still alive and well and still a journalist and could talk to you about Dr. Briggs. But I feel from the way in which the company was advised by their lawyers ahead of that litigation, it looked pretty likely that they were going to lose. And I think that possibly the plaintiffs at the time were poorly advised. Obviously the case was left open by the judge as well, so it wasn't a sort of definitive decision. Val Williams actually sent me an email. I've never really spoken much because she's sort of a bit of a kind of side figure from the rest of the group. She'd probably be a really interesting person to talk to. I don't know if you've spoken to her, but she was the and she did actually say to me in an email, I think on Friday, you know, that she could. There's no reason why she couldn't reopen her legal challenge, and that might be a way forward. Partly because I've worked with a lot of different groups, campaign groups, and I'm hugely impressed that this one has survived for so long. But in all campaign groups there are fractions and people break off, and that is probably actually less so in this group than most that I've come across. I mean, I could go back through my, I didn't expect you to ask me that question, so I could go back through my notes and see if there's anything specific about the way in which that case collapsed. But I think another interesting thing, I know you had, I've forgotten his name, who came in here, I just saw him leaving, chap with shortened R. So some interesting letters as well about this, because he wasn't aware of the case at all. But then he had a letter from his lawyer saying, steer clear of trying to take legal action because there's 30 witnesses lined up to give evidence on behalf of the company. And he wasn't even part of the group. So there was definitely the sort of sense that the company had loads of witnesses. And I think if you look through the documents in Berlin, there is a lot of work around trying to persuade Tuchman to become one of their expert witnesses. We consider what he said about the way in which they had behaved. It's quite extraordinary that I think by the end of it he does agree to become a witness on their behalf. And I don't understand why he did that if his view was that they were guilty. But, you know, I'm not. Obviously, we all know it's extremely difficult to get, you know, damages in a medical case, and it very rarely ever happens.
Jason, can I suggest, if there are things that you want to add or whatever, you please feel free to do so. And perhaps you will accept that there may be things we want to come back and re-question you about things. So thank you so much for coming today, and thank you for the work that you've been doing.